I thought I knew the man who raised me, until the day he was arrested, right in our family company's boardroom. The charges? Money laundering for a criminal organization from 25 years ago. But what he never saw coming wasn't the FBI breaking down our doors or the federal investigation that had been building against him for months. It was me, his own daughter. The one person he trusted completely had been the architect of his downfall all along. My name is Megan Walker, and for 34 years, I believed I was living the American dream. As CEO of Walker & Hayes Properties, I controlled a real estate empire that my father David had built from nothing in Savannah, Georgia. Every morning, I'd walk into our gleaming downtown headquarters, past the marble lobby with its gold-lettered company name, and feel the weight of legacy on my shoulders. Dad was everything you'd want in a father figure. Successful, respected, the kind of man who shook hands with mayors and had his picture in the business section of the Savannah Morning News. At 62, he still commanded every room he entered, his silver hair perfectly styled, his handshake firm enough to seal million-dollar deals. The local Chamber of Commerce had named him Businessman of the Year 3 times running. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and shared ambition. He'd groomed me from childhood to take over the company, teaching me to read financial statements before I could properly tie my shoes. Business is about trust, he'd always say, and family is the only trust that matters. I lived by those words, working 16-hour days to prove myself worthy of the Walker name. The company was thriving beyond our wildest expectations. We were on the verge of signing a $15 million contract with an international investment firm. Our biggest deal ever. The preliminary meetings had gone perfectly. Swiss investors impressed by our portfolio of luxury developments along the Georgia coast. Everything was falling into place exactly as Dad had planned. But even in paradise, there were shadows I chose to ignore. Strange cash transactions that Dad handled personally, always with a dismissive wave when I asked questions. Certain clients who paid in untraceable methods, men in expensive suits who spoke in whispers and never stayed long enough for proper introductions. I told myself it was just the quirks of high-stakes real estate. Then there was the man who'd started appearing around our offices, Marcus something, tall and weathered, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much. He'd ask for Dad by name, wait in the lobby with the patience of someone who knew secrets. When I'd mention him, Dad would grow quiet, his jaw tightening in a way that ended conversations. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was reviewing contracts in my corner office when I noticed Dad's computer screen still active in the conference room. A moment of curiosity that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. An encrypted email sat open, containing account numbers for offshore banks and references to something called Project Clearwater, the exact same code name from the Swiss investor document sitting on my desk. My hands trembled as I read further. Shell companies, numbered accounts, transaction histories that painted a picture I couldn't comprehend. The dates went back 25 years, long before our company's official founding. Names I didn't recognize, places I'd never heard Dad mention, and amounts of money that made our legitimate business look like pocket change. When Dad returned and found me there, his face went through a series of emotions I'd never seen before. Surprise, calculation, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. "We need to talk," he said quietly, closing the laptop with deliberate care. I wanted to give him the chance to explain, to make this make sense. But deep down, I already knew that the father I'd worshipped, the business I'd devoted my life to, and the future I'd carefully planned were all built on lies I was only beginning to understand. The conversation Dad promised never happened. Instead, he spent the next 3 days avoiding me, scheduling sudden business trips and lengthy client meetings that kept him out of the office. When we did cross paths, he'd smile that practice smile and ask about quarterly projections as if nothing had changed. But I'd seen behind the curtain now, and I couldn't unsee it. I started my own investigation that weekend, using my executive access to dig through files I'd never questioned before. What I found made my stomach turn. The offshore accounts weren't just connected to our current Swiss deal, They were threaded through every major transaction we'd made in the past 5 years. Shell companies with names like Meridian Holdings and Coastal Capital Solutions, all leading back to a web of financial entities that existed only on paper. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how little I actually knew about Walker & Hayes properties. Our client roster included individuals who paid exclusively in cash, purchased properties through Byzantine corporate structures, and never seemed to actually live in the luxury condos they bought. I cross-referenced addresses with public records and found a pattern that chilled me. Many of our clients were connected to investigations in Miami, Tampa, and Jacksonville. I spent sleepless nights in my home office, following digital breadcrumbs that led to a world I'd never imagined. Bank records showed transfers to companies based in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, always in amounts just below federal reporting thresholds. The dates told a story of systematic money movement that had been happening since before I'd graduated college. The breakthrough came when I found Dad's backup email account, hidden in a folder labeled Property Maintenance. 25 years of communications painted a picture of a man I'd never met. References to cleaning services and portfolio management that had nothing to do with real estate. Names like Vincent Torino and Samuel Reeves, men who spoke in code about washing and cycling money through legitimate businesses. My hands shook as I read an email from 1999. David, the Florida operation is getting too much attention. Time to relocate and start fresh. The Georgia opportunity looks promising. Remember, family businesses are the best cover. They're harder to investigate and easier to explain. When Dad finally cornered me in the office on Wednesday, I was ready for him. He closed the door to my office and sat across from my desk with the weight of defeat in his shoulders. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. "Enough to understand that our entire life is a lie," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand the forces we're dealing with. These people don't just disappear when you want them to. They own pieces of your life, and they collect on those debts eventually. So you decided to make me an unwitting accomplice. I made you safe," he said firmly. "Every document, every property, every contract, it's all in your name for a reason. Legal protection. If anything ever happened to me, you'd be insulated." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't his daughter and successor. I was his shield. Every promotion, every responsibility, every moment of pride I'd felt in building this company had been orchestrated to make me the perfect legal barrier between him and the consequences of his choices. "I need time to think," I said, fighting to keep my voice from breaking. "Don't think too long," he warned, standing to leave. "And don't do anything stupid. You're not just protecting yourself now, you're protecting our entire family legacy." As he left, I realized he'd just made his biggest mistake. He'd assumed I'd choose family loyalty over justice, that I'd be willing to live with the truth as long as I could keep the lie comfortable. But he'd underestimated the one thing he'd taught me best, that in business, as in life, there's always a price to pay for betrayal. I opened my laptop and started making calls. The private investigator I hired was worth every penny of the $10,000 I paid him. Within 2 weeks, James Morrison had assembled a file that read like a crime novel, complete with photographs, financial records, and witness statements that painted a picture of my father I could never have imagined. David Walker hadn't always been David Walker. From 1992 to 1998, he'd been Danny Walsh, financial coordinator for an organization called the Black River Crew, a sophisticated money laundering operation that had moved over $200 million through legitimate businesses across Florida. The FBI had been closing in when Danny Walsh simply vanished, leaving behind a federal warrant and a trail of financial crimes that had never been solved. The photographs Morrison showed me were devastating. My father, 25 years younger, shaking hands with men whose names I recognized from newspaper headlines about organized crime. Bank records showing systematic transfers through a network of businesses, restaurants, construction companies, and real estate firms, all designed to convert illegal profits into clean money. "Your father was good at what he did," Morrison explained, spreading documents across my kitchen table. Too good. When the heat got too intense, he didn't just disappear, he reinvented himself completely. New social security number, new birth certificate, new life history. Moving to Georgia wasn't random, it was strategic. Far enough from Florida to avoid recognition, close enough to maintain certain business relationships. The most damning evidence was a series of letters between my father and Vincent Torino, a man Morrison identified as the current head of what remained of the Black River crew. The correspondence, dating from 2003 to just last month, showed that Walker and Hayes properties had never truly gone legitimate. We'd been laundering money continuously, using our reputation and my credentials to provide the perfect cover. The beauty of the operation, Morrison continued, was how he used your success to validate the business. Every award you won, every civic recognition, every mention in the business press, it all added legitimacy to what was essentially a criminal enterprise. I felt sick reading about clients I'd personally welcomed into our offices, investors I'd shaken hands with, deals I'd celebrated. All of it had been theater, and I'd been the unwitting star performer. But the most shocking revelation came in a police report from 1997. Danny Walsh hadn't just been a money launderer, he'd been an informant. When the FBI had started closing in on the Black River crew, he'd begun feeding information to federal agents in exchange for immunity. The investigation had been blown when someone tipped off the organization, and Danny Walsh had been marked for death. That's why he disappeared. Morrison said, he wasn't just running from the law. He was running from former associates who considered him a traitor. The identity change, the move to Georgia, the legitimate business front, it was all about staying alive. The final piece of the puzzle was a current FBI surveillance file. My father was still a person of interest, and Walker and Hayes properties had been under intermittent observation for the past 3 years. Federal agents had been building a case, waiting for the right moment to move. They're close, Morrison warned. My sources say they're planning to make arrests within the next 6 months. The only question is whether you'll be swept up in it or whether you'll be smart enough to distance yourself first. I stared at the photographs of my father, my real father, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just about discovering his criminal past. This was about realizing that every moment of my life had been orchestrated by a man who'd been willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his secrets. He'd built my entire career on quicksand, made me the face of a criminal organization, and positioned me to take the fall when everything inevitably collapsed. Every "I'm proud of you" and "you're ready for this responsibility" had been calculated moves in a game where I was both the prize and the sacrifice. As I gathered up Morrison's files, I realized my father had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd taught me to be ruthless in business, to always think 3 steps ahead, and to never show mercy to anyone who betrayed my trust. Now it was time to put those lessons to use. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Dad's personal attorney with the kind of grave formality reserved for funeral arrangements. Harold Brennan had been our family lawyer for 15 years, but today he couldn't meet my eyes as he spread the documents across my desk. Your father wants to restructure the company's ownership, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Transfer all assets into a family trust, with him as the sole trustee. He says it's for tax purposes and estate planning. I read through the legal language, my business degree serving me well as I decoded what this really meant. Dad wanted me to sign over everything, every property, every account, every piece of the empire I'd helped build, into a trust he would control completely. I would retain a title and a salary, but no real power and no legal ownership of anything. This is interesting timing, I said, keeping my voice steady. Right as we're finalizing the Swiss investment deal. Brennan shifted uncomfortably. Your father mentioned that the international partnership requires certain structural changes. Foreign investors prefer dealing with trust arrangements rather than individual ownership. It was a smooth lie, delivered by a man who'd probably been practicing it for days. But I'd learned to read between the lines of legal documents, and this wasn't about foreign investors. This was about making me a figurehead while Dad prepared to disappear again, leaving me holding the bag when the FBI finally moved. I'll need time to review this, I said, gathering the papers. David hoped you could sign today. Brennan pressed. The investors are expecting confirmation by the end of the week. I stood up, signaling the meeting was over. I said I need time. That evening, Dad came to my apartment, something he'd never done before. He sat in my living room, looking around at the space I'd bought with my Walker and Hayes salary. And I realized he was cataloging everything I stood to lose. Harold says you have concerns about the trust arrangement, he said. Just being thorough, I replied, pouring myself a glass of wine and deliberately not offering him one. This isn't the time for overthinking. Megan, we have a narrow window to make this transition smooth. Transition to what? He leaned forward, his expression hardening. To a structure that protects this family. There are forces at work that you don't understand. And I need to know that you're going to support the decisions I make. I took a sip of wine, meeting his gaze. I've always supported you, Dad. Haven't I? You have, he said, his voice softening slightly. And I'm proud of the woman you've become. But this business, it's more complicated than you know. Sometimes protection requires sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? The kind that keeps you out of prison, he said bluntly. The kind that ensures you have a future when this all shakes out. I nodded slowly, as if I was beginning to understand. And if I sign these papers, I'm protected? Completely. The trust arrangement creates legal barriers that can't be penetrated, even if there were investigations. You'd be insulated. I set down my wine glass and looked at him with what I hoped appeared to be dawning comprehension. You're not talking about tax planning, are you? I'm talking about survival, he said. For both of us. The next morning, I called Harold Brennan and scheduled a signing ceremony for the following week. I told him I wanted to make it special, a family celebration of our new partnership. He seemed relieved, probably eager to close what had clearly been a difficult file. But I also made other calls. To Morrison, asking him to accelerate his investigation. To a lawyer in Atlanta who specialized in white-collar crime, seeking advice on federal immunity procedures. And to Sarah Martinez, an investigative journalist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who'd been trying to get an interview with me for months. Dad had taught me that in business, timing was everything. He'd also taught me that the best deals were the ones where your opponent didn't realize they were being negotiated with until it was too late. As I prepared for our signing ceremony, I realized I was about to give him the most important business lesson of his career. Never underestimate the student you trained too well. The game was about to change, and this time, I was going to be the one setting the rules. Kendrick West had been waiting 15 years for this phone call. When I reached him at his Atlanta headquarters, his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd finally been dealt the right cards. Megan Walker, he said, drawing out my name like he was tasting something fine. I wondered when you'd figure out what kind of man your father really is. West had good reason to hate my family. In 2010, Dad had systematically destroyed his construction company through a series of legal maneuvers that had left West bankrupt and his reputation in ruins. Dad had called it competitive business practices. But I'd learned enough about his methods to know it had been personal and vicious. I'm not calling to apologize, I said during our meeting at his gleaming new office. I'm calling to make a deal. Wes leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of calculating look I recognized from my own mirror. What kind of deal? The kind that gives you everything you've wanted for 15 years. Walker and Hayes properties, delivered on a silver platter. Over the next 2 hours, I laid out a plan that would have impressed Dad with its ruthlessness. West Group would become the shadow buyer for 3 of our most profitable development projects. I would redirect contracts, manipulate zoning approvals, and ensure that Walker and Hayes lost every competitive bid for the next 6 months. By the time Dad realized what was happening, West would control the majority of Savannah's luxury development market. You're talking about destroying your own company, West said. I'm talking about destroying his company, I corrected. There's a difference. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Using Dad's own shell companies and offshore accounts, I could move money in ways that would appear legitimate on the surface while creating a catastrophic cash flow crisis. West would buy our distressed assets at fire sale prices, then flip them for massive profits once the market recovered. "And what do you get out of this?" West asked. "Justice," I said. "And a job, if you're offering." West extended his hand. "Welcome to the winning team." The execution began immediately. I used my CEO authority to authorize strategic investments that were actually fund transfers to accounts West controlled. I renegotiated supplier contracts to include penalty clauses that would bankrupt us if we missed deadlines, then ensured we missed those deadlines. I leaked confidential information about our Swiss deal to business journalists, raising questions about Walker and Hayes' financial stability that spooked our international investors. Each move was calculated to cause maximum damage while appearing to be the result of market forces and poor business decisions. Dad began to notice the problems within weeks. But by then, the damage was spreading too quickly for him to contain. "We're hemorrhaging money," he said during an emergency board meeting. "The Swiss deal is on hold. 3 major projects are behind schedule, and our credit lines are being called in." I maintained my concerned expression while internally celebrating every word. "Maybe we should consider selling some assets to stabilize our position." "Absolutely not. We weather this storm, whatever it takes." But the storm was just beginning. I had Sarah Martinez publish a series of investigative articles about irregularities in Savannah's real estate market, with Walker and Hayes prominently featured. The stories raised questions about cash transactions, anonymous buyers, and the sudden appearance of federal investigators in our offices. Dad's paranoia reached new heights as he watched his empire crumble. He hired private security, changed his daily routines, and began meeting with lawyers at all hours. But he still trusted me, still believed that his daughter would never betray him. That trust was the weapon I used to destroy him. When the board of directors called for an emergency vote of no confidence, I was the one who seconded the motion. When the bank demanded additional collateral for our loans, I was the one who advised Dad to pledge his personal assets. When federal investigators requested documents, I was the one who prepared the files, carefully selecting evidence that would damn him while protecting myself. Dad had taught me that in business, loyalty was everything. Now I was teaching him that loyalty had to be earned, not just expected. The final phase of my plan was about to begin. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday, but Dad arrived early, pacing the conference room like a caged animal. His usual composure had cracked over the past month, replaced by the desperate energy of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "I know what you've been doing," he said when I walked in, his voice barely controlled. I set my files on the table with deliberate calm. "I've been trying to save this company, just like you taught me. You've been sabotaging me. The West Group contracts, the leaked financial information, the convenient timing of every disaster." He stopped, studying my face. "My God, it's been you all along." "Yes," I said simply. "It's been me." The admission hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Dad's face went through a series of emotions: shock, betrayal, and finally, something that looked almost like respect. "You planned this perfectly," he said quietly. "Used my own methods against me. I'm almost proud." "Don't be. This isn't about business strategy. This is about justice." He laughed bitterly. "Justice? You have no idea what justice looks like in this world. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just another player in a game you don't understand. I understand enough to know that you built this empire on lies, used me as your shield, and planned to let me take the fall when everything collapsed. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself, and now you're going to pay for it." The other board members began filing in: Harold Brennan, our chief financial officer, Patricia Martinez, and 3 external advisors who'd been growing increasingly nervous about our company's direction. They took their seats with the grim expressions of people attending a funeral. "Before we begin," I said, standing at the head of the table, "I have some information that the board needs to review." I opened my laptop and began projecting documents onto the conference room screen. 25 years of evidence, carefully organized and annotated. Bank records showing systematic money laundering. Photographs of Dad with known criminals. FBI surveillance reports. The complete financial history of Danny Walsh and his transformation into David Walker. What you're seeing, I said as the board members stared in horror, is the true history of Walker and Hayes Properties. We haven't been a legitimate real estate company for a single day of our existence. Dad sat frozen, watching his secrets displayed for everyone to see. You're destroying everything we built together. We didn't build anything together. You built a criminal enterprise and used me as your cover story. Patricia Martinez was the first to speak. Megan, are you saying that all of our transactions have been part of a money laundering operation? Yes. Every major client, every cash deal, every offshore account, all of it designed to clean money for organized crime. Harold Brennan stood up abruptly. I need to call my attorney. This meeting is over. No, I said firmly. This meeting is just beginning. I nodded toward the conference room door, where two men in dark suits had been waiting. Special Agent Robert Kane and his partner entered with the measured pace of people who'd done this many times before. David Walker, Agent Kane said, you're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The room erupted in chaos. Board members shouted questions. Patricia Martinez began crying, and Harold Brennan was frantically making phone calls. But I kept my eyes on Dad's face, watching as he realized that every move he'd made to protect himself had been anticipated and countered. You called them, he said as Agent Kane began reading him his rights. I gave them everything they needed to build their case. Every document, every transaction, every connection to your former associates. 25 years of evidence, gift-wrapped and delivered. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Dad looked at me with something that might have been admiration. You learned well. I learned from the best, I replied. And now I'm better than you ever were. The federal agents led him away, past the marble lobby with its gold-lettered company name, past the photographs of civic awards and business achievements, past the empire he'd built on lies and maintained through betrayal. I watched from the conference room window as they put him in the back of their car, and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a job well done. The news vans arrived within an hour. By evening, Walker and Hayes Properties was the lead story on every local station and the business pages of newspapers across the Southeast. Savannah Real Estate Empire Built on Crime read the headline in the next morning's paper, accompanied by a photograph of Dad in handcuffs. I called a press conference for Friday afternoon, knowing that hiding would only fuel speculation and conspiracy theories. The media had already begun digging into my role in the company, and I needed to control the narrative before it controlled me. Standing behind the podium in our conference room, facing 24 reporters and camera crews, I felt the weight of 25 years of lies pressing down on me. But I also felt something else, a clarity I'd never experienced before. I want to address the recent allegations against my father and the future of Walker and Hayes Properties. I began, my voice steady despite the chaos of the past week. First, let me be clear. I had no knowledge of any criminal activity until recently. When I discovered evidence of financial irregularities, I immediately contacted federal authorities. The questions came fast and hostile. How could I not have known? Was I complicit? What about the employees who would lose their jobs? The investors who'd trusted us? The clients whose projects were now in limbo? I understand the anger and disappointment, I said. I share it. But I also believe in accountability. Walker and Hayes Properties will be completely restructured. Every transaction will be reviewed. Every client will be vetted, and every employee will be cleared through proper channels. We will emerge from this as a legitimate business, or we won't emerge at all. Sarah Martinez, the journalist who'd helped expose the story, raised her hand. Are you saying you're willing to sacrifice the company to make things right? I'm saying I'm willing to sacrifice the lie to build something real. The press conference lasted 2 hours. When it was over, I felt emotionally drained, but strangely liberated. The truth was out. The consequences were beginning. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. But the real test came that evening when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for the county detention center. "You have a collect call from an inmate," the automated voice said. "Will you accept charges?" I almost hung up. Almost. But curiosity won over anger. "Megan?" Dad's voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Please don't hang up. I'm listening. I need you to understand something. Everything I did to protect you. The money, the business, the connections. It was all about giving you a future. You gave me a future built on quicksand. I gave you opportunities, success, respect, things I never had growing up. You gave me a lie and expected me to be grateful for it." There was a long pause. "What happens now?" "Now you pay for your choices, all of them." "And us? Is there any chance?" "There is no us," I said quietly. "There never was. You made sure of that when you decided to use me as your shield." I hung up without waiting for his response. The phone rang again immediately, but I turned it off. That night, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by boxes of company documents that would need to be turned over to federal investigators. My entire life was in those boxes: contracts I'd signed, deals I'd celebrated, relationships I'd built on foundations of sand. But mixed in with the evidence of crime and corruption were also genuine achievements. Properties I'd developed that housed real families, jobs I'd created for honest people, charitable contributions that had made a difference in our community. The challenge now was separating the real from the false, the legitimate from the criminal, the future from the past. I opened my laptop and began composing a letter to our employees, our clients, and our community. It was time to begin the long process of rebuilding, not just a company, but a life based on truth instead of lies. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. 3 months later, I stood in what had once been Dad's office, watching the maintenance crew remove his portrait from the wall. The mahogany frame left a pale rectangle on the dark paneling, like a ghost of the man who'd ruled this room for decades. The federal investigation had moved swiftly. Dad's assets were frozen. His associates were being rounded up across 3 states, and the Swiss investment deal had evaporated the moment news of his arrest broke. Walker and Hayes Properties was officially under federal oversight, with me serving as interim CEO while the courts decided whether the company could be salvaged or would be liquidated entirely. I'd spent the past week in depositions, testifying about my father's activities and my own unwitting participation in his schemes. The prosecutors had been surprisingly sympathetic, recognizing that I'd been both victim and whistleblower. My cooperation had earned me immunity from prosecution, but it couldn't erase the knowledge that I'd built my career on blood money. The hardest part hadn't been the legal proceedings or the media attention. It had been the employees, good people who'd lost their jobs because of crimes they'd never suspected. Patricia Martinez had found work with a firm in Atlanta, but she'd looked at me with a mixture of pity and disappointment during her final week. Harold Brennan had been disbarred, his legal career ended by his association with Dad's activities. But there had been unexpected moments of grace. Several clients had come forward to express support, praising my decision to cooperate with authorities. 3 former employees had asked to return if the company survived its restructuring, and Kendrick West, true to his word, had offered me a position with his firm, not as an executive, but as a project coordinator, a chance to rebuild my career from the ground up. I'd declined. If I was going to start over, I wanted to do it on my own terms. The phone on Dad's desk, my desk now, rang with the distinctive tone of an outside call. I'd been getting dozens of them each day, mostly from reporters and law enforcement officials, but this one was different. "Walker and Hayes Properties," I answered. "Megan, it's your father." I'd been expecting this call for weeks. Dad had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, and I'd heard through his attorney that he wanted to speak with me before being transferred to his permanent facility. "What do you want?" I asked, To tell you that I'm proud of you, he said quietly. What you did took courage. Real courage. More than I ever had. I did what had to be done. You did what was right. There's a difference. I looked around the office, at the empty walls, the packed boxes, the remnants of an empire built on lies. Do you regret it? Any of it? I regret that you had to be the one to end it, he said. I regret that I couldn't be the father you deserved. But I don't regret protecting you, even if you don't see it that way. Goodbye, Dad. Goodbye, Megan. Build something better. I hung up and walked to the window, looking out over the Savannah skyline. The city stretched before me, full of possibilities and new beginnings. Tomorrow, I would clean out the last of the office files and turn over the keys to the federal marshals. Next week, I would start job hunting, probably in another city, under the weight of a name that would forever be associated with scandal. But tonight, I was free. Free from lies. Free from the weight of someone else's sins. Free to build a future based on truth instead of deception. I picked up Dad's portrait, looked at it one last time, and dropped it in the trash bin. Then I walked out of Walker & Hayes Properties for the final time, ready to discover who Megan Walker really was when she wasn't living in her father's shadow. Some stories don't have happy endings, but they can have honest ones. Thank you for listening to this story of family, betrayal, and the price of truth. I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what you thought about Megan's journey. Please subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss how far you'd go to seek justice against someone you love.